Alright, in this video I'm going to tell you how to make billions of dollars in profit by building a giant nuclear-powered vehicle that will make conventional rockets obsolete. So here's our treasure map, a delta V map of the solar system. Using this, we can tell how much faster a certain spacecraft needs to go in order to reach a certain destination. How much faster something goes is a change in velocity, the V in delta V. And here is the Tsiolkovsky rocket equation, which tells us how much fuel we need to burn to reach a certain delta V. The higher the delta V, the more energy we need to use. Now look at this. Here's the Earth, and here's low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station is. Delta V is 9.3. Now here's the Moon. Delta V from the Moon surface to lunar orbit is 1.6. From the lunar orbit to geostationary transfer orbit is also 1.6. And from geostationary transfer orbit to low Earth orbit is 2.5. If you add them all up, we get the delta V from the lunar surface to low Earth orbit. 1.6 plus 1.6 plus 2.5 is 5.7, which is more, 9.3 or 5.7. In other words, it requires less energy to fly to the International Space Station if you start on the Moon 3 days and 384,000 kilometers away than if you start in Florida 6 hours and 400 kilometers away. This is partially because the Moon has lower gravity, but it's mostly because the Moon lacks an atmosphere. Now, don't get me wrong, atmospheres are great. I feel really privileged that I get to swim in this nitrogen soup with all of you. Just 8 billion strangers all constantly inhaling and exhaling the exact same medium as each other, swapping organic particulates from one set of lungs to the other, from one mouth to the next. Just one big happy family eating from the same wet trough. I love that every time I step outside, my DNA doesn't get shredded by ultraviolet radiation, or that temperatures don't fluctuate by orders of magnitude every night and day. So we are lucky Earth has an atmosphere, it's why life exists. But like an undiagnosed Oedipal complex, it can make leaving home somewhat tricky. In order to get something off this primate-filled public pool of a planet, you have to package it in an aerodynamic structure and then apply tons of force from behind and really shove it up there until eventually it pops out of the atmosphere. Then we have to go really fast to keep it up there. Leaving the Moon is much easier. All you have to do is go really fast. And you don't need to be aerodynamic at all, which removes a ton of constraints, allowing you to scale structures up to be extremely large, achieving huge cost reductions. So it makes sense that in a future in which humanity inhabits giant space stations and zips around the solar system on nuclear-powered starships, those platforms and vehicles would have been built on the Moon. That's why the Moon is considered humanity's stepping stone to the stars. If you're following this series, we currently have a lunar base capable of hosting 220 people at a time. But the goal is not to host tourists, or even to develop a lunar economy. The goal is to become a solar system spanning civilization, and we do that by building the kinds of massive spacecraft, orbital stations, nuclear tugs, factories, and mining systems that allow us to access the vast resources of the heavens. And the most logical place to build these things is on the Moon, at least at first. But needless to say, these things require a lot of capital and resources to build. So to build them on the Moon, we need some development. And for development, we need a local economy. And now we actually have that. A measly little thing, sure, but it's a start. So now the question is, how do we grow this seed from what is essentially a small lunar hotel to a full-blown shipyard? From Plymouth to Charleston Naval Yard? The answer? Nuclear-powered ferries. They're as magical as they sound. Currently, our lunar economy's growth is stifled, not by the amount of people interested in becoming a lunar tourist, but by the amount of people who can actually afford a $550,000 ticket. And much of the cost associated with that ticket is due to the fact that once such a large and heavy rocket like Starship reaches low Earth orbit, it has exhausted most of its fuel. SpaceX's solution to this is to perform orbital refueling maneuvers whereby a moon-bound Starship full of people or cargo is sent into orbit first, and then 5 to 8 ships whose payloads are fuel are sent up to rendezvous with the moon-bound ship, where they offload their fuel directly into it, juicing it up before it leaves. So for each trip to the Moon, 5 to 8 fuel launches and orbital docking sequences have to be performed, making up the vast majority of launch costs. To put numbers on it, 80 million of our $100 million cost to Luna comes from these refueling missions. If we could remove those, it would reduce costs to the moon significantly and greatly open up our addressable market, meaning we could host tons more people, generating much more revenue. And in fact, we can remove this orbital refueling constraint by building a spacecraft, a large spacecraft, whose sole purpose is to transit back and forth between the Earth and Moon. Instead of refueling in low Earth orbit and then making the journey to the Moon and back, the outgoing lunar ships will just rendezvous with this giant orbital station and offload their people and cargo, then dip back into the atmosphere. And this is amazing because it means we have a reason to start building spacecraft on the moon that directly plays into our pre-established business model. It is not some random thing we decide to branch out into later. We actually have a connection for this that directly serves our tourism-based business model. And I haven't even mentioned the best part. We can power it using open cycle gas core rocket engines. For brevity's sake, I'm not going to go into exactly how these work, but what's useful to know is that these are nuclear fission powered rocket engines that use vaporized uranium with unparalleled energy density to generate orders of magnitude higher specific impulses than the most powerful rocket engines currently used on Earth, with high impulses ranging from 2,500 to 7,000 seconds, and high thrust ranging from 20,000 to 400,000 newtons. Also, I'm not talking about hypothetical tech like warp drives or even theoretically possible but far-flung like fusion drives. This is established technology, as designs for these already exist and have been worked on since the 1960s. When it comes to well-established near-term rocket engine tech, nothing beats the open cycle gas core engine. There's just one catch. The exhaust they spew all over the place contains vaporized uranium gas, which is radioactive, poisoning everything within a 10-mile radius, making it a war crime to ever use one of these on Earth. But they can totally be used in already highly irradiated space. This is why it makes sense to build a ferry that transits to and fro rather than building some permanent orbital infrastructure like a fuel depot that just harnesses economies of scale to reduce costs. This would apply those same economies of scale to an even greater degree and also couple them with the raw power of nuclear fission. Anyway, by this point, we're already good at making big steel hermetically sealed life support equipped structures on the moon, which is just a hop and a skip away from making spacecraft. And in some ways, it's easier. We don't have to dig and bury the whole thing, for instance. But we probably should make it somewhat spherical. Although it doesn't have to be aerodynamic, we still want to account for pressure bulging. We also need to figure out the whole strapping a giant fission-powered rocket engine to it thing, but nothing about this plan is technically insurmountable once you've gotten to this point in the lunar development phase. So I guess the last thing to do is try and put some numbers on it. How much would this reduce launch costs, and how much more revenue could we generate from it? Well, as these things go, there's no way to know for sure, but we can guesstimate. Keeping our Starship flight numbers, we'd have a low Earth orbit flight cost to rendezvous with this ship of about 20 million. Then an unknown cost from low Earth orbit to the moon using this nuclear ferry. In other words, we do know how much it costs to get from the ground to low Earth orbit, but we don't know how much this thing costs to fly from low Earth orbit to the moon. How much did it cost to research and develop and build? How large is it, and how many trips can it make during its useful lifetime? Fortunately, we do know each flight would be at least less than 10 million, which is the marginal flight cost from the ground to low Earth orbit, which it is not doing. That's the whole point. In all likelihood, it would probably be less than 1 million per trip, because it should have a very long lifetime, since again, it's not getting beat up flying through an atmosphere. It just peacefully floats between the moon and low Earth orbit. But let's just go with 1 million per trip as a conservative estimate to account for amortized R&D and build costs. This would result in a transport cost to the moon of 21 million. Using our aircraft data, once again, this would open up our target market to include piston airplanes and would increase from 11,000 to 18,000. But the only reason we used aircraft data in the first place was because we wanted a correlating interest with spaceflight in a market where people could afford the outrageous price of a ticket, so we counted recent sales of $500,000 aircraft. This is why we didn't just count millionaires, because even they couldn't afford a ticket, only the ultra rich could. Also, we limited our number of people per flight to just 200 since it is a 3-day flight, but if we are able to accommodate many more people on the nuclear ferry, then we can reduce ticket costs even more. We could build this thing to carry 1,000 people, but if it just carries 400, which is still less than a Boeing 747, then the cost per ticket would be reduced to just over $50,000, which means that, actually, we can just count millionaires. Polls have shown that 35% of US adults say they would be interested in orbiting Earth in a spacecraft. So, if 35% of people with at least 1 million opted to purchase a ticket, the serviceable market would be over 30 million people. With 30 million people purchasing a $50,000 ticket, if we just add a 1% profit margin, which would only add $500 to each ticket, then we'd have a profit, not revenue, but profit potential of over 15 billion.
I do believe in
nuclear-powered space.
fairies.
At this point, our development potential would actually run into hard physical limits like launch frequency. If you launch one ship to low Earth orbit a day with 400 people aboard, which one launch a day is ambitious as hell. To put it into perspective, the record number of launches a year is 96, which is basically one launch every 4 days, as you have to consider weather and logistics and whatnot. But anyways, if we could hypothetically launch one ship a day, we could serve 146,000 people a year, and we'd still have a 205-year-long wait list. 2 centuries. So what this means is we can have a much greater profit margin than 1% per ticket. And if we just auction off tickets, letting market demand decide, then there's no telling how much we could earn. Interestingly, by this point, Starship-like rockets will now be relegated to the role of low Earth orbit transfer vehicles, using their non-nuclear, ancient Methalox engines to carry supplies from the ground to orbit without polluting the atmosphere. The first step in a beautifully efficient logistic chain binding together the Earth, orbital, and lunar economies. Wait, that sounds familiar. Once you've gotten to this point where you're regularly building massive lunar habitats and nuclear-powered ferries, it's not hard to then move on to building massive orbital stations, factories, and all those other things we dream about. Well, that's the short version, my elevator pitch on how to develop the moon. Shout out to new patron supporter Rick and channel member Stephen Reed, and as always, many thanks to continued support from Brandon Hicks, Jonathan Crone, and Mustafa Mond. It's been a long journey. Thanks for sticking with me.